And we'll get the show started. We have a nice program today, and we've got some great speakers and a panel. And then we have a quiz at the end of it, so make sure you take copious and appropriate notes. So my name is Jim Wunderman. I have the honor of being your host here at the Bay Area Council, where we're really proud of the work we do on the international scene, especially when it comes to economy and trade. It's something that we've been doing for a long time. It's nothing that we could do without the leadership of Dr. Sean Randolph, who has really been phenomenal in this role for a long time, and all of you know him well. And so just a hand for you, Sean. I don't know how exactly you do it, but he's in addition to doing all these reports, he's a marathon runner, and I think that things kind of go together, because I think a lot of these reports are a marathon. So today, welcome to the community surrounding Canada and the relationship between Canada and the Bay Area, San Francisco and Silicon Valley. We're really proud. It's a relationship that's a very positive one. It goes back a long way. The last time we really looked at this relationship from an analytical perspective was way back in 2007 when we did our last report on Canada. Who remembers 2007? Can you name any? Oh, you remember? Ronna remembers it. I don't remember anything that happened in 2007. I'm sure if I researched it, I could come up with it. But it's a while ago, and things have a tendency to change in economic relationships and so forth. So I think our strategy has been, well, Canada has been one of our leading trade partners and economic partners for a long time. I believe it's the #2 trade partner with the state of California, certainly very strong here in the Bay Area. So it's important for us to give it a good look, and I think this report does that, although I have to admit I've only skimmed it so far because the ink is still, be careful of your fingers because the ink is still wet on this report. So, but just looking through it, I think you'll see that it touches on really important areas. And it's got a great name, Hemispheric Partners, Trade, Technology, and Innovation Ties between the Bay Area and Canada. So it's a very powerful, very powerful name. I remember a few years ago, one of the things about the Bay Area that is a little bit under the radar is what an important role leaders from Canada, business leaders from Canada play in our major companies. And I was invited to a dinner at the Canadian consulate, I remember a few years ago, and I thought, well, this is nice and I'll do this. And then, there I sat with some of the real, top leaders in business. I was kind of in awe. And they were all very involved with and connected to their companies, but to a person, they were also very connected to Canada. And the conversation that we had, was largely about what was happening in Canada and relations between the U.S. and Canada and that sort of thing. And so it really triggered me to think about, we don't think about this that much, and you could apply this to other countries too, and we do, because we engage in analytical reporting on a lot of different relationships. But the one with Canada, I think, is particularly important, and some of the leaders that we've had here in the Bay Area from Canada are really top people, including people in this room. So, thank you for your commitment to your country as well as to the Bay Area and to your respective companies. We were pleased to see a new trade deal. We weren't as pleased to see NAFTA set aside, but we were pleased to see a new deal negotiated between the United States and Canada and Mexico. We'll probably talk about that a little bit, and it would be our view to be supportive of that. We go back to Washington, D.C. with our annual trip. That'll happen in late May if anyone's interested. And one of the things we'll probably talk about is the ratification of that new agreement. So this is going to be, I think, an interesting event, and I'm looking forward to hearing from our Consul General as well as from the great panel that's been put together for this. So without any further ado, let me introduce our Consul General of Canada, Mr. Rana Sarkar, who's a very, very good friend. So Rana was appointed Consul General for San Francisco, Silicon Valley in 2017, with accreditation for Northern California and Hawaii. He's a member of Canada's NAFTA Advisory Council. He previously served as National Director for High Growth Markets at KPMG, one of our major executive committee level companies, and co-chairman of the advisory board at the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. From 2009 to 2013, he was president and chief executive officer of the Canada-India Business Council. You could probably pass this quiz, Rana. In 2005, Mr. Sarkar co-founded Content Partners, a global content agency, sold in 2009, and in 2001, the advisory firm Rawlings Atlantic Limited. He began his career as a consultant at the Roland Berger Strategy Consultants in London and Munich, and helped establish Roland Berger in India. He also served as a visiting lecturer at the London School of Economics and the Cass Business School at the University of London. So he's a young man, but he's been very busy, you can see. He attended London School of Economics, Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, and at the INSEAD Executive Program in France. He's a member of the Advisory Council of the Moat Centre for Policy Innovation, Canada 2020, and the Literary Review of Canada, and he's a distinguished fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs, University of Toronto. Mr. Sarkar is married to lawyer and author Reva Seth. They live in San Francisco with their 3 children and oversized labradoodle. So I know that's a really good thing. Mr. Rana Sarkar, Consul General of Canada.
The key takeaway for me on that is I need a shorter bio. Young man, thank you very much for that, and I tend to think of myself as well preserved. But on the other hand, first of all, I'd like to say a great thank you to Jim and to Sean Randolph for the work that they do here at the Bay Area Council. I can think of no finer institution to be associated with for a report like this at this particular time, you know, in both the history between our two countries, what is particularly taking place between the Bay Area and the kind of the real sort of takeoff of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, the importance, the structural importance of this area in global economic terms, and also in terms of the relationship with countries like Canada in the new geopolitical context. And so there's just a set of issues and contexts that are coming together to make this report and the kind of work that you're doing here extremely important. I would be remiss without saying a thank you to our team as well, Yves Vallot, who is one of the great forces behind the scenes that made this report come to light, and some of our other team members, Kate Walters here, Terry Cowell is here as well, and so thank you very much. And of course, thank you to the sponsors who also contributed, and I think that, you know, Air Canada is here. Where would we be without physical connectivity and the commitment of Air Canada? Serge and team here who are here, thank you very much for being here, because it's such an important component of the relationship between the two areas, and that network mesh is extremely important. And for Silicon Valley Bank as well, who plays such an important role in the institutional architecture of this valley, but also, you know, have recently opened up in Canada, and we've been very supportive of that, and I think that's going to be a thickening agent for the nature of the relationship between the two places. What I will say, and I'll let the panel speak for itself, and I think that the report gets into some extraordinary detail, and there's much more below that detail as well. But we'll say something about the nature of the relationship, as Jim had mentioned, was broadly, this has been a historical relationship of great importance for both places. It's been something which has been a gradual progression that has emerged into something which is strategically very important and often overlooked in terms of the institutional architecture, in terms of the trade thinking between the two areas, and that is between Northern California particularly and Canada. So there's thick institutional connections, particularly through universities, but also through some of major industries. And the trade speaks for itself, and I won't get into that in great detail. What I will say, though, is in global context, particularly given the nature of economic change right now and the global geopolitical refashioning of power, the relationship that we have in the trade and all of the ebbs and flows, that sinew that connects the two places, did not happen by accident, and nor will it continue without effort in this next context. And so I leave you with that because it's something that we often, overlook. But this next period and this next decade and beyond is going to be more challenging than what we've had in the past. Something we're going to have to work much closer together. The final thing I will say is that most of what occupies my time down here is what I would call the fourth industrial revolution pillar building. And what that really is about building the institutions and personal connections, the sensing functions between the two ecosystems here in the Valley, given that this is in global terms, not just because it's $4 trillion of market capitalization within, sort of a 100-kilometer stretch. That's about 68 miles or something like that. But it's not just because of that, but also because of the outsized importance of the institutions of this area. And we do not, we take that very seriously, and we do not, overlook that at all. And I think that the connection point between the Valley, particularly, and about 6 or 7 other nodal hubs in the world are going to have outsized importance in the fashioning of the intangible economy. And that's where most of us are going to work. It's certainly where our children are going to work. And I'm here, part of my appointment was on behalf of the Prime Minister to come down here to help forge that connection point. And I think that our team works on that every day. We admire the work that all of you do, and would endeavor to stay connected with everyone for that. So thank you very much. I shall invite up whoever's next to get the panel going, I think. And it's Sean Randolph, who is also going to tell us a little bit about the report, and invite up the panel, and hope we'll go from there. Thank you.
Right, so here we go. So thanks, Jim, and thanks, Rhonda. And also, thanks very much to EW, who actually kind of drove this report from the moment we framed it right through to its delivery for the consulate. So we have a really great team on this. As Jim mentioned, we've been doing these kinds of reports at the Institute for well over 10 years, looking at the ties of the Bay Area with its most important global trade and investment partners, who are also partners in R&D, in developing intellectual property, intellectual capital, exchange of talent. And one of the earliest countries we looked at when we began this process was Canada in 2007. I remember 2007, but it was so long ago. It was before the global crisis. It was like another era. So a lot happens in that amount of time, and we thought it was maybe a good time to get caught up to date with all the changes here in the Bay Area and in Canada. So we couldn't do it without partners and sponsors, so I want to be sure to thank, again, obviously Canada's Foreign Ministry for stepping up to enable us to do this work, but very importantly, Air Canada and Silicon Valley Bank for being our 2 private sector sponsors and really adding content to the study and enabling us to see it through from the beginning through the fruition. So thank you very, very much. And there's a great team from Air Canada here today. Talk to them over wine afterward. And I was happy to see that people had already dug in the wine, so maybe that'll keep the conversation flowing. Help yourself as we're chatting away here. So to get into it, there's a lot of detail here. So if you go to the report, you'll find more than you ever want, but I'll just hit a few of the high points. So first, we're looking at Canada's economy. So, and I'll just describe what you'll find in greater depth in the report. So it's really driven by 4 large sectors: real estate, manufacturing, energy, and financial services. we often here, I think of Canada as a natural resource producing country, and it is. It's the world's 6th largest energy producer, a big source of energy for the US, 5th largest exporter in the world of energy. But a lot of other natural resources too, lumber and other things that are heavily imported here by us in the US. The economy has been volatile sometimes because of that dependence on natural resources. But it's also a stable economy with modest but really healthy growth. It's a nice growth rate, 1.7% expected for the coming year, with really good trends. Unemployment's falling, wages are rising, investment in Canada is going up. So these are good trends that connect us here as we see similar patterns in the Bay Area. But what's really important in looking at the economy is the shift that's underway. A lot of it by change within companies, a lot of it by focus initiatives by the government, both federal government, provincial government, city governments, and of course companies, to move the economy off its heavy reliance historically on natural resources and traditional manufacturing, and again, volatile natural resources. Because anybody who's dependent on oil and gas is going to know you're going to be up and down. To one that's more based on advanced manufacturing, the generation of intellectual property, technology, and services. And so that's the shift that's underway. It's now that Canada is turning its back by any means on those traditional historical industries, but this is the direction that the new Canadian economy is going. And as just one example, financial services is a really important part of the economy, about 7% or so of GDP. And these bars about employment kind of tell the story in a different way. You can see what the growth in employment has been over about a last 4-year period. Really strong growth. That bottom bar, the green, that's mostly technology-related things. And you can see the fall off in employment in the traditional natural resources sectors. So looking at trade, it is an extremely important relationship for the US as well as for California. So Canada is the largest market for US goods and services exports. There's been a lot of focus on trade over the last couple of years as the renegotiation of NAFTA has come up and a lot of noise in the air about whether it's equitable or not. The fact is that the US runs a small deficit in goods, but it actually runs a net trade surplus due to a surplus in services exports from the US. So all in all, we sell about 94 cents for every dollars of imports. And so it's a trading relationship that is basically in balance. A little bit more in goods, a little bit less in services, but a relationship that, as healthy relationships are in trade, in balance. A lot of that is complementary, and Rana pointed to this earlier. It didn't happen by happenstance. We have a long border, we're historical neighbors, but it didn't have to be that strong. But going back about 30 years, we had US-Canada trade agreement. We had NAFTA, which has really helped to make our economies much more integrated and much more complementary even than they would have been before. With all of that, so Canada is California's second largest trading partner. It's after Mexico, but it's ahead of China. People talk a lot about China appropriately, but it's actually a bigger relationship with Canada currently than it is with China. Something over $45 billion in trade. 2007 was the last year we had the number for, about 1.2 million jobs in California that are supported by that trade activity. And if you look at what the pattern is, the biggest category of what we're selling to Canada is technology related. And that's both the hardware, the goods, as well as technology related services. Tourism is really big. A lot of Canadians come here, and I go out in Richardson Bay sometimes in the fall. I see fleets of sailboats with Canadian flags. They're all moving south. But, lots of Canadian tourists come here to California and the Bay Area. And of course, we're seeing change in the structure of the relationship now through the trade agreements. NAFTA is in place. We have the new US-Mexico-Canada agreement. I think Canada might have preferred to put US-Canada-Mexico, but it's written the way it is. And so we were, as Jim said, We felt that NAFTA was working well, that it probably needed to be updated. It had been in place for a long time, and some interesting things have happened through the new agreement. And we think getting that agreement ratified is going to be very important. Which isn't to say there aren't issues out there still. There's the ratification of the agreement. We still have some outstanding issues around the U.S. Steel and aluminum tariffs, despite the new agreement, that haven't been resolved. And there's also this residual of what happened with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, of which we were a member along with Canada. And of course, we pulled out. The other members decided to go forward without the U.S. The door is open for us to come back, of course. But I think under the leadership of Canada's Prime Minister, the name was changed. And I think Canada is actually going to be more competitive vis-a-vis the U.S. in Asian markets. Say Japan, for example, there'll be a lot of benefits, lower barriers to trade between Canada and, say, Japan or other Asian economies that the U.S. will not be able to take advantage of because we're not in TPP. So maybe someday we come back. This just shows with some updated 2018 figures, not year-end, but pretty close. The balance between imports and exports. Again, this is good trade right here. If you throw in services, the U.S. line moves up a little bit, but it's basically a strong, balanced relationship. And of course, California being the #1 exporting state for agriculture in the nation, we'd be failing something if we didn't mention agriculture. Again, a relationship that's basically a healthy one that's in balance. So looking at investment mirrors the trade story. So the U.S. accounts for about half of all the foreign direct investment currently in Canada, and Canada is actually the second largest source of foreign direct investment coming into the United States. Where is it coming and going? In what sectors? Well, in the Bay Area, of course, given what our economy here is about, it's a lot in technology, biotech, renewable energy, and of course, financial services. Canadian pension funds are really big investors globally, including here in California. And what are we investing in Canada? Well, it's a reflection of what we're doing here. It's cloud computing, it's semiconductor design engineering, informatics around health, software, fintech, data centers especially. So there's sort of this mirroring of mutual investment flows around these emerging technology fields. Also the talent side, the talent is part of this narrative, and Jim mentioned that too. We've heard different numbers over the years about how many Canadians are in the Bay Area. We didn't put a number in the report because it seems to be subject to some uncertainty and some verification. But we do know that there are pretty close to 800,000 Canadians living, residing in the U.S., and the largest concentration of Canadians living in the U.S. are here in California. And they have been making extraordinary contributions to the economy. So many people in leadership positions in management in a lot of our major companies, in R&D company founders, and in the report you'll see a parade of names names you'll recognize, of people who have founded companies or are leading companies who are in fact from Canada. I often kind of think of Canadians as like, remember the science fiction movie, the pod people, like they look the same, you hear the difference. But you don't know they're there until you ask them, and you realize like every fourth person in the room is actually Canadian. So it's good for us. We can use the accent maybe. But this carries over from just the big companies, of course, the name brand companies, to a lot of the new startups. So of the latest sort of class of billion-dollar companies, along with Israel, they're pretty much the same number. Canada is the #1 source, or #2, depending on how you want to rank them with Israel, of founders of billion-dollar companies in the U.S. Of the 9 that we counted, 6 of those billion-dollar companies with Canadian founders are here in the Bay Area. The Silicon Valley and the Bay Area in general, is a draw for Canadian startups, as it is for startups from absolutely everywhere in the world. So they're coming here, and it doesn't matter where they're from. They could be from Europe, they could be from Asia, but they're very often coming for the growth capital, the high amount of venture capital available here, and by the opportunity to kind of compete with the best and scale their companies globally. And that's happening with a continuous flow of startups from Canada coming here. But also, we're finding that startups are being attracted, from the Bay Area into Canada. And what's that about? Well, I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute, but it's around great Canadian incentives. It's about a really strong environment for science. It's about positive, receptive immigration policies. But it's also about the growing internal viability and self-sustaining nature of the ecosystem for startups in Canada generally. And it's, guess what, lower cost. We're a pretty expensive place, especially if you're on a tight budget as a startup. There's a lot of reasons why they are continuing to come here in large numbers from Canada and other places. But in fact, we're finding that Canada has a lot to offer, including a lower cost of doing business. So what about that tech ecosystem? This is really what I took away as kind of, if there was an exclamation point or a bottom line, kind of a top line story in the report, this would be it. That Canada, based not on luck or happenstance, but really focused, continuous investment and strategic thinking, has developed, is developing really world-class technology clusters in a variety of fields that are complementary to what we're doing here. AI is huge, big data is huge, gaming, clean tech, healthcare, all developing rapidly in Canada. Again, a lot of this is happening with government encouragement and support at the federal level, at the provincial level. Cities are involved, they're moving skills up the value chain through recurring major investments in education at all levels. And one of the interesting initiatives has been the establishment of 5 basically business-led innovation, what are called superclusters across Canada. These are really public-private enterprises with seed funding from the national government, but commensurate investment by local partners as well. So public-private partnerships focused on research and entrepreneurship. About $950 million Canadian was initially invested by the government. We're also finding that the major cities, especially Toronto, but also Montreal, Quebec, and Vancouver, are developing, or they have developed, dynamic university clusters, accelerators, local venture networks, and startup ecosystems. So the big story is Toronto. We find so many of our companies with a presence in Toronto, but it's not just Toronto. Each one of those cities has its own specialties and its own defining clusters. And one of those sort of base points for all of them is talent. Canada has an extraordinary percentage of its population with advanced degrees, and I think the talent is really one of the major assets that Canada is investing in and is building on. With that said, I think the Bay Area is the Bay Area, Silicon Valley is what it is, and it remains a really important draw for Canadian companies, Canadian talent, Canadian startups, as they moved, like other countries, to plug gaps in the ability to scale, to achieve big finance, to become global companies. So it's really a complementary flow in both directions, but very heavily based more and more as time goes on innovation and technology. So what is the government doing in research and private companies too? These are just a number of organizations who we talked to in the course of the report. Some are purely scientific, others are public-private, some are based in cities as initiatives, others are or national research centers, but it's just indicative of the heavy and continuing and, from what we can see, successful investment that's being made across Canada in science and in R&D. Again, complementing the kinds of interests and the kinds of things we do here in the Bay Area. And this is kind of small print here. So these are the 5 regional superclusters, and you can see each has a different focal point based on the distinctive strengths in that particular city and region, and based on the co-investment by partners there. So digital technology in British Columbia, protein food industries in central Canada with Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, advanced manufacturing in Ontario, of course, the major manufacturing center in Canada, right across the border, of course, from a lot of that in the US. AI in Quebec, and ocean-related industries in the Atlantic provinces. So I mentioned Toronto. We're seeing Toronto as really a growing, not just as a national, but as a global hub for everything to do with fintech, AI, cybersecurity, blockchain, and data analytics. Lots of businesses, lots of tech workers, lots of tech jobs being created. There was an article we saw last year saying that more tech jobs were created in Toronto last year than here in Silicon Valley. Could be true. Tremendous growth. And about a third of all the venture investment happening across Canada is in Toronto, just as about a third of all the venture investing in the US has historically been here in the Bay Area, closer to 45% lately, but again, the #1 place where venture is concentrated. Major initiatives to amplify these clusters, the Toronto Discovery District, the Mars District in Toronto, Quayside, a big development, sort of a sustainable city development on the waterfront supported by Alphabet. And again, the University of Waterloo being really a premier university at a global scale around technology. All of these are assets that are attracting a lot of Bay Area companies. Venture investment growing about $3.5 billion last year, a lot of details. Both the funding is up and the number of deals is up. And again, this isn't just Toronto, it's across Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, as well as other cities. About 40% of that is coming from the US, including a lot of Bay Area venture firms. Sequoia, Greylock, Salesforce, Foundation, 500 startups, but a lot of others have an active presence and a growing presence in Canada, and we'll hear, I think, a little bit more from Silicon Valley Bank in a few minutes. So to kind of wrap this up, there's some things to think about. Sometimes complex issues here. One is immigration policy. I think Canada has done a pretty nice job with immigration policy. Public opinion there is, based on the latest polls we've seen, is very supportive of immigration. 65% of people in the last poll I saw said immigrants make the country stronger because of their work and talents. That's a wonderful statement. I think we struggle with that a little bit these days here in the US. That is, I think, enabling more talent to come into Canada now than ever before, based on the growth of this tech economy, but also the fact that immigration policies are broadly receptive and encouraging to that, especially for international applicants who are especially coming from the US, but also from places like India and China, where it's becoming a little bit more difficult these days to come into the US. We have a lot of our major Bay Area companies that have their Canadian headquarters, very large R&D operations across Canada, especially in Toronto. And when we look at the future, I think what we see is a lot of opportunity, a really strong foundation across many, many different sectors and variables, a really strong history of collaboration with a relatively open border and relatively fluid movement of talent and people in both directions. A lot of shared values, and when we talk about alignment of interests and values, say between California and Canada, an obvious case is clean energy, climate resilience, a big commitment in Canada, obviously a big commitment here in California across all of our recent governors, and especially here in the Bay Area. Quebec's cap-and-trade system is part of California's, linked to California's through the Western Climate Initiative, and I think issues and topics like energy and climate provide a really terrific foundation to do more and more together in the future between the Bay Area and Canada. So there's a lot of detail in the report. We won't give you a quiz because you haven't had time to read it. It just came off print maybe 2 hours ago. But encourage you to read it. It's online. Anybody can just pull it off the web as of this afternoon. But with that, let's bring our illustrious panel up, and we'll have a little conversation about what was in the report, but what the experience of our panelists is around these topics. Get some of your comments and questions, and we'll sort of continue with the wine and the beer in the back. So, come on up. that's in the front row, so we're not, he's going to be susceptible to this whole conversation. You can sit there and come up here too, we're going to pick on you. So our panel, we have Laura Bueller, who's the Executive Director of Sue 100, and that is the organization of Canadian business leaders, really senior executives here in the Bay Area that are really supporting Canada's presence, giving it focus, and connecting back into Canada. We're really pleased that Trent is the Chief Economist of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, has flown to be with us from Toronto. Thanks very much for making the trip, Kevin. And then Alexander Levy, who's the Chief Scientist with Silicon Valley Bank, which is an area council member, and also the bank is the sponsor of this report. So we appreciate that. And the bank has just opened its office in Canada, in Toronto, so we'll hear a little bit more about that. So I'll just ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to whatever people want to talk about. But maybe with you, Trevor, let's start with you. Could you tell us, in your own words, what you see the trend being, the direction in Canada's economy? You talked earlier about some of the transitions underway. How do you see that process going as Canada diversifies and starts to put more chips on the technology side of the service side?
Yeah, definitely. That's what I really like about this report, actually, is that it gives a really great snapshot of this transition that's taking place in the Canadian economy. And traditionally, historically, Canada has been known for manufacturing and for natural resources, and it really demonstrates kind of these new industries that are really coming up in Canada, almost as a first step in the future direction of the economy. So, I mean, in terms of the actual kind of macroeconomic direction of the Canadian economy, I mean, it is projected to take a bit of a slowdown this year, as you showed, 1.7% by the World Bank. IMF came up with a report a couple of weeks ago saying that they kind of downgraded for 1.5% real GDP. But it's a bit of a mixed bag, or it's almost a tale of two economies in a lot of ways. So the technology industry, or the innovation economy, if you will, what's taking place in Toronto and a lot of the urban centers, is a huge success story. I mean, the amount of jobs that are created in Toronto and in the tech sector, in January and February, I think Canada created 120,000 jobs, right, in a country of 36 million people. And that was primarily in the service industry in Ontario. And it's doing great. You mentioned some of the initiatives that are taking place, the superclusters, digital technology in Vancouver, the proteins industry, which will continue to help Canada feed the world with plant-based protein. The advanced manufacturing supercluster in Ontario is really kind of leveraging the existing competitive advantage that Canada has in that industry. Artificial intelligence supply chains in Quebec, the ocean supercluster in the Atlantic is also very interesting in terms of renewable energy. We have what's Quantum Valley taking place in southern Ontario, outside of Waterloo. Canada trying to create a model of Silicon Valley for quantum computing. It's all really interesting. But what you also pointed out too is that there are some industries, mainly energy and mining, natural resources, that aren't doing so well recently. And a lot of people talk about this shift from an old economy to a new economy. In some ways, I think it's a bit of a false dichotomy. I mean, there are a lot of really interesting innovations and technologies that are being applied in those industries, whether it comes to smart mining, whether it comes to sensors on pipeline technology. That I think there's a big opportunity for Canada to focus on those areas to not have those aspects of the economy fall behind. And so I think this report really kind of lays that out quite well.
Great. Let's maybe say a word about the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. It's got a lot of attention here, in the news a lot, right down to the wire. From a Canadian standpoint, how did that work out? What's kind of the balance of interest or benefit for Canada at the end of the day?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that the new agreement is better than the previous agreement for Canadians, at least. A lot of people, or some people call it NAFTA 2.0. It's almost more like NAFTA 0.7 for Canadians in some ways. But I think Canada lost as little as possible in those negotiations. You know, apart from some of the long-standing trade issues, whether it comes to softwood lumber or the dairy industry, those tariffs are certainly going to be difficult to deal with, and you see that with the manufacturing sector in particular in Ontario. You know, GM's plant closed in Oshawa. That's not necessarily because of the tariff. I mean, they closed the plant in the U.S., they closed the plant in South Korea at the same time. It's more just kind of a change of strategy for them. But Fiat Chrysler also just closed their plant in Ontario a couple of weeks ago too. And so we really kind of see this shift taking place. But it's also increasing compliance costs. Because a lot of these companies now need to keep track of you know, how much of their materials is coming from the domestic economy, what wages are being paid for the people that are developing those products, because there used to be a $16 an hour minimum for the amount of domestic content that's being produced. And so that's just kind of increasing the cost of business for some of those firms too.
Thanks. Laura, why don't we talk a little bit about talent? So your data, your members are really senior members of the business community. You're from Canada, but you're also seeing, I think, flows of startups. Here from Canada, but you also see where they're coming from and the growth of the environment in Canada. So tell us what your thoughts are about the growth or development of the sort of eco environment for startup activity in Canada, and how does it relate to Silicon Valley?
Okay, so first of all, I think it's important to set the tone about Canada's geographic position, our special relationship with the United States, and not to mention that most of us speak good English, not everybody, but we have a linguistic advantage as well. That's not a joke. we're bilingual country, but most people, whatever their first language is, also not most people, a lot of people speak English. So I think that Canada has a preferential access to the U.S. market that actually other countries don't. And so there is a historic. You've gone over much of the history. I saw dating back to the fur trade even in this report, which is fantastic. Historic relationship of Canadian talent and the U.S. market. So already we have this advantage. You mentioned my organization's members. So the C100 is a not-for-profit, San Francisco headquartered organization that actually has its heart and soul in mentorship and opening up local market access for Canadian entrepreneurs. And 99.99% of the entrepreneurs that we support are actually headquartered in Canada. And so our model is to find very exciting up-and-coming Canadian technology entrepreneurs and give them access to this market in a way that they otherwise would not have. The glass door is something that a lot of immigrant groups, including Canadians, have talked about when trying to break into Silicon Valley, and our MO is not to shatter it, but just to open it and open doors for Canadian entrepreneurs. What has changed since 2007, of course, beyond almost everything in the economy, is that Canada has actually started to see some success in the technology sector. And so the need, and not to mention the need for Silicon Valley, has lessened actually compared to other technology hubs. It's across the United States. Even Kansas City is producing unicorn technology startups. Salt Lake City, Boston, Austin, Atlanta, and so the tech ecosystem has become less geographically constrained to the Silicon Valley. That's a great thing. But what it also means is we've got an imperative to become much more interconnected and web-like as a network, both for Canadians but also as a technology community. To your question on talent, there used to be a lot of talk about Canadians. Let's just talk about entrepreneurial talent for now. Entrepreneurs needing to move here, especially when you talk about, let's say, Silicon Valley one generation ago in the aughts, right, or in the late 90s. And people say, yeah, I moved here because someone wrote me a $30 million check, and I never could have gotten that in Canada. And that was largely true. That is still true for some people in Canada today. However, the situation has changed, right? There's everybody down here is trying to invest in Canada. My team and I came from a big Silicon Valley VC today, and the partner there just said, Canada is hot. So I'm not surprised you're getting so much interest. It's true, everyone wants to put their money outside of Silicon Valley. They're looking for places to invest after the success stories in many other ecosystems. So it has meant that Canada has an opportunity to retain that talent. I think the important thing also for all of us to know is that the private sector is much less nationalistic than we would think. So people want to stay where they are, but they will move if they have to. And so in Canada, it's become favorable to stay there for a lot of people. Now, what's happening on the talent side, so all the people that they want to hire, that is actually still a constraint for Canada when comparing to the Bay Area. A lot of talent problems that startups used to have in Canada is they just couldn't hire anyone. Today, actually, there's a lot of engineering talent in Canada, people who've been trained up, some degree of expats, Canadian expats here moving back, but more there is a local technical industry that is training people a lot, and they don't all have to move south of the border to pursue the career of their dreams. However, the technology industry is nascent, right? It's only, compared to Silicon Valley, the size of it and the length of it is much, much smaller. And so we are still struggling in Canada to find that executive level talent who has the experience of scaling tech companies. And that is what we still hear from Canadian technology companies back in Canada, is this talent is still very elusive to them. The question of whether people are moving or not, I think that this is a question of probably economics. People move largely for opportunity, pay, and career growth. And the Bay Area still, I think the last report I saw still outshines even our best city in Toronto in terms of a net migration gain. So there still are more Canadians moving to the Bay Area than are the reverse, and that's expected. The size of those job markets is proportionate. But maybe that'll change with the rise of Canada. The visa programs as well, I mean, we've covered them in the report here. The visa programs that Canada has put in place over the last couple of years completely blow the H-1B out of the water. They're incredibly competitive. Our community in Canada has shown pretty strong support for this global skills strategy that was implemented a few years ago. Anyone here on an H-1B visa knows you basically win a lottery once a year in the month of April. They're given out, and it's reserved for highly technical talent. It's a widely used visa by the private sector as well, and it's difficult to get. It used to be quite likely that you'd get it, and today I think this year was 25 or 30% of applicants actually were awarded an H-1B visa. In Canada, it's 10 business days or less. You can get an engineer, hire him from Kiev or Palo Alto or New York City, and you can have someone working in your office almost immediately and on a rolling basis. So the moves that Canada has made are, I'd say, for real. They have shown up to the global war on talent and pretty much ready to do whatever it takes to empower the growth of this incredible sector in Canada. So that really changes things. Probably why you see so much, foreign companies setting up their offices to take advantage of that system.
You should probably copy your laws, but thanks, Laura, very much. So Alexander, so let's turn back to technology. I love talking to some of these titles, chief scientists, that understand what they do.
Me neither.
Weather related. So, can you tell us first what Silicon Valley Bank is doing in Canada? You just got your business license there, I think, maybe 2 months ago? Okay, what's up?
Well, so do that, and also, I felt a lot of the slides that you were actually presenting, I felt very personally connected to them. So I'm one of those secret Canadian American executives. So I'm from Toronto, born and raised, did all my education there. Started 2 spin-off companies from the University of Toronto. Was funded in some of those by the Canadian government, some of those by the Ontario government, some of those by Google, one of those by 14 American venture firms. And the experience that you just heard of Canadian entrepreneurs being told, hey, if you would just move to the Bay Area, we've got a lot of money available for you. That exact conversation happened to me. And in fact, that's how I wound up in the Bay Area, which is one of our companies, which was an AI for drug discovery company. In the early AI sort of deep learning days, that was the condition of the funding. And that's how I wound up here. And then a series of events led me to Silicon Valley Bank. So SVB has been involved in Canada for quite some time. And for those that don't know, Silicon Valley Bank is a real force in the banking world behind venture-backed companies. About 60% of US venture-backed companies bank with the bank. And most of the top 100 US VCs bank with us. So that's really an out-and-out majority of both of those categories in the United States. So of the tech IPOs last year, something like 60 or 70% of them banked with SVB in whole or in part. That's pretty wild. But we've looked at Canada for a while, but Canada, to my disappointment originally as a Canadian, was sort of treated like an ancillary market to the northeast region of the United States. So like we'd have folks from the Boston office who would fly into Toronto as if Toronto was sort of an extension of Boston. It's pretty strange if you're from Canada to think that. And so increasingly, for all of the reasons that you mentioned in your report, it's been obvious that Canada has been emerging much more as its own market. So the biggest difference, just in terms of the things that I've seen directly, is companies like the ones that I and other colleagues at U of T founded are much more likely to be able to survive independently and thrive in Canada now than they were even 10 years ago. And so in fact, a very large proportion of those best companies in quantum computing, machine learning, and AI, and robotics, and so forth, are staying in Toronto, not out of necessarily a sense of patriotism, but it is just the logical thing to do on a number of dimensions. So SVB is responding to that. And so the way SVB responded to that is to say, well, we'd like to be a full-bore bank in Canada. We'd like to really go and do it and set it up the same way that we have a UK bank, a German bank, a Chinese bank, and so forth. We want a Canadian bank. So we did that. And let me tell you, the Canadian regulatory process, a lot more rigorous than the American for banking, something that our regulators are very proud of in Canada. We got there. And just last week, I was in Canada for the launch of that bank. And so the CEO of SVB came, and his main joke, just to give you a sense of how many people showed up at the launch, was people were so packed into the Toronto Film Festival building for the launch that he asked, wait, I guess you don't have fire codes in Canada. Okay? So it's a big new market for us. And frankly, one of the most interesting, exciting things from my point of view, so I run the AI and machine learning function at Silicon Valley Bank, among other things. And my plan for the next year, in terms of where I'm going to be hiring my AI and machine learning staff, places a majority of them in Toronto. Yeah. So that's sort of some of the ways that we're seeing it.
So they will be physically in
They will be physically in Toronto, yeah. Yeah, just like a little bit from like where I would have, my apartment would have been in college.
I'd like to give Silicon Valley just a tiny bit extra credit than what you just did as well.
Okay.
You said that Silicon Valley has been reacting to what's happening in Canada. I would say Silicon Valley has been investing in Canada for a long time,
Yeah.
serving that market, and in fact, they've been supporters of C100 since I think day one. And
Right.
so they've been they knew it was a long game from the get-go, and that whole team in Boston, yeah. So it's
Right on.
not just a reaction
Yeah.
to a market that they
That's
you know,
like just- they
awakening
just
to
woke
it.
up.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
they've been very intentional about their investment into that market and helping the ecosystem grow and
Yeah.
create ties between the Valley and Canada.
Totally. And can I add just one more thing
Yeah.
about the changing nature of venture capital? Because this really moves a lot of, particularly entrepreneurs, which is the thing that I've been sort of most exposed to. You know, with our last company, so back in 2011-12, I was among a team of co-founders that started an AI for drug discovery company. So this was back in the days when no one really knew these terms, convolutional neural networks or deep learning neural networks. These were relatively obscure terms. And we were proposing to do deep learning neural networks for medicinal chemistry. And we put up AI for drug discovery. And I assure you, basically anybody you could have presented to in Canada, we tried, right? And the way that a lot of Canadian investors, in my opinion, perceived at the time was, okay, deep learning neural networks, at that time, a fairly unproven technology, that looks very risky. Drug discovery, colossally expensive and huge rates of failure, that looks really risky. So now we've got like stupid times stupid, so it's gonna be like stupid squared, and so we're definitely not gonna invest in this. And we went through a very long and protracted process with a lot of Canadian venture firms. But what we saw was actually very few were willing to bite the bullet and take the levels of risk that their American counterparts were. And that's been a common refrain about Canadian VCs. That has radically changed in the last 10 years. There are now very substantial Canadian-based venture firms that have a risk profile that's virtually identical to their American counterparts, that are leading or co-leading major deals into each of these frontier deep tech areas. And so that appetite around risk has changed. And the amazing thing about that we've seen is that tends to be a self-reinforcing cycle. Because if these venture firms take these risks, and a couple of these things pay off in a very large way, that is money back into the pockets of all the limited partners and all of the general partners in those firms that they're going to go reinvest in another generation of companies. And that's one of the primary drivers of why the venture system has worked here in the Bay Area, which is that when those big exits have occurred, the reinvestment then occurs, and that has been self-sustaining and growing over many years. And I'm seeing that now in Canada for the last decade or so.
Interesting.
Yep.
Well, maybe you could say something also, since you are a chief scientist.
Sure.
You came out of the University of Toronto, about kind of the infrastructure for science in Canada, say especially Toronto, but not just Toronto, because what we're seeing, I think, is a lot of indigenous investment within Canada, but large Bay Area companies that are really heavily invested in big data and AI, fields you're really deep on, going in a big way into Canada, partnering in Canada. So what does that trend look like? When did it begin? Where do you see that leading?
Okay, yeah, sure. So there's a few dimensions to why Canada might be favorable for where to place your science and research and development work. So first of all, probably a lot of you are aware there's a large number of incentive programs. And those incentive programs are very compelling. But if you've been in sort of the media, film, and television, there's a whole set of incentives to come film your film in Canada. And so the reason that every film set in New York looks like it's set in Toronto is because it's set in Toronto, because we maybe paid 30 cents on the dollar to have you come do that. There are similar incentives, actually, for all kinds of science and experimental research and development. And those are compelling. Those can be quite compelling. They can really change the cost profile for running an R&D business. So that's one. But number two, and actually kind of most importantly, in my opinion, is that the really top people want to be around one another in different fields. So if you're really at the top of your game in AI and machine learning, you actually care, you index on that almost more than financial considerations. So in Toronto, there is a new nonprofit AI research institute called the Vector Institute. Now, it was formed by a bunch of our colleagues who are at the University of Toronto, who are some of the alumni around machine learning that have since achieved a lot of the success that we've seen. The Vector Institute is 15 months old. It's gone from 0 researchers to 270 researchers in 15 months. Okay, and it is certainly, I would say now, the leading institute of its kind in Canada. It's likely going to be very swiftly recognized in the world. And when I was there last week in meeting with them, their entire thesis as to how they operated is, if we grab a certain sufficient number of the really top people, the rest follow naturally because they want to be alongside the best. And so if you can do that in quantum computing, if you can do that in various kinds of protein manufacturing and engineering, it does become self-sustaining, and those clusters then build upon themselves. And so those are the two main factors that I see driving it. One is the cold, hard financial calculus, and the other is, I want to be among the best. And some of those, in some fields, are in Canada.
Cool.
Yep.
Very cool. I saw Niels Eric coming in. Are you back there, Niels, somewhere? Oh, so Niels was the co-author on this and put a lot of hours in. Thank you, Niels. So why don't we open it up for questions and comments from the audience, and you can also direct them to Rana if you want to. There's a lot we can talk about, but we have a little time for your questions and comments. Don't be shy. I'll ask one to Robert. So immigration. What are you seeing around, well, there's been a lot of shifts in the U.S. in the last 6 to 8 months around immigration. More difficult for spouses of H-1B holders to work. Slower processing of H-1B applicants. It was just in the paper last week. More difficult processing for L1, intercompany transfer visas and all the like. So if you look at the flow of talent across the board in both directions between, say, the Bay Area, California, and Canada, and you look at Canada's efforts to attract startup and other technology talent, as the Bay Area, maybe the Bay Area is probably the primary beneficiary of the whole U.S. of relatively overmoving people, intellectual capital. But as the U.S. as a whole is kind of moving the opposite direction from Canada, what are you seeing particular trends in terms of visa holders from here going to Canada, or companies that, with us hearing actually, that are maybe headquarters here putting more activity in Canada because it's easier to attract work talent, if that's what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question. I think it certainly speaks to the trend of, squat over here for a second. But certainly speaks to the trend that we're seeing and experiencing. We were both at a panel recently where I ran across an Indian colleague, and he mentioned that there were 400 police clearances per month now that people require to, Indian families require to go to Canada. They're processing 400 a month now. That's a 400% increase over the month prior. And part of that is just a sort of reflection of where some of the constriction lies. And I think the H-1B process, the recognition that there are many people in this queue that will not be processed at all. They're looking at 50 years as a potential horizon, some astounding numbers like that. And the spousal visa, which is the greatest disaster, are being canceled. And so as a result, you have people here who are extremely high skilled with the ability to go anywhere, who, if you look at the history of the Valley over the course of the last 100 years, have been the absolute bedrock of every generation of successive startups and the institutional fabric of this place. That the current generation is now starting to look elsewhere. So we're starting to get this part. We're part of this talent arbitrage, as it were. And for us, it's I think Canada. And this is not a this is just a little history of this as well. Is that there have been other periods in Canadian history when the U.S. has gone through a particularly aggressive immigration regime over a very short period of time, where Canada disproportionately benefited. One was during the McCarthy era, where a lot of the Canadian universities, and we talked about that phalanx of good public universities, many of the sort of the faculty that came out after the war, a lot of that was a result of the folks who then came after they left the U.S. during that period. A second period was during the Vietnam War. And so I think that we're in another moment right now where this arbitrage is working in Canada's favor. We are hearing it a lot from U.S. companies, particularly talent companies, where it's not just the global skills visa, which I think has been an extremely successful thing, but it's this part of it's partly a recognition that talent now works triangularly and in various quad formations around the world, and so it's not just a U.S.-Canada thing, it's a U.S.-India-Canada thing, or it's a U.S. Name a country Canada thing, and so there's a much more complex scenario that is taking place right now. But certainly there's a let's see for the foreseeable future until something changes at the federal level, potentially here. We're likely to see that outcome.
Thanks. Sean, can I just speak to that? I mean, it's when you ask investors, foreign investors that invest in Canada, what is the number one reason why they do? It's usually talent, skills, human capital, education levels. We have the highest per capita post-secondary education level in the world. And Canada's skills and talent strategy right now is really on point. It's so apart from different types of immigration visas, there's also what was recently created. They piloted what's called the Atlantic Immigration Pilot in the Atlantic region because it's easy for Toronto and Vancouver to attract immigrants. It's a lot harder for instance, more rural areas of the country or smaller cities to do so. And so they created a fast-track stream to match skills for immigration applicants to businesses that are pre-approved, and they're allowed to say what skills they need, and it's almost like a matching service for pre-screening and for accelerated immigration. Secondly, apart from the Canadian Chamber represents 200,000 businesses from all sectors, all regions, all sizes of business, from large corporations to the smallest businesses. And something I hear whenever I'm talking to any business in Canada is that they're having difficulty finding the skills that they need in the economy. And really, and I give the federal government complete kudos for this in their last federal budget. They created these individual learning accounts, which are, the model of education is changing. We're moving more towards lifelong learning and reskilling and upskilling constantly because the economy is changing so quickly. And so each Canadian is going to be given, a certain amount of money, up to $5,000, over time, to take 4 months off to learn new skills or to upgrade their skills. And this is something incredible that I'm not sure if I've seen in other jurisdictions. And so Canada's strength in skills and talent, we're really doubling down on that.
I think that's a fantastic point, and it's also, it's not magical, right? I think that the thing that can't be understated, although it is underscoring everything, is that Canada has a long-standing tradition of free public education at a high quality. All of our best universities are public universities, the University of Toronto and McGill and UBC, and all of those schools are public institutions. It costs $3,000 a year to go to McGill as an undergraduate. And so I think you're talking about all these, these great stats that we're the most educated country in the world. It's true in large part because it's accessible. And so when other countries look at Canada, I think, especially the US, that's an important point. Some of this is really cool tactical things, and some of it is like not magical. It's really about publicly funded, high quality education as well.
By the way, I mean, beyond the legal dimensions of the visa process itself, there is a cultural component that's very important. So just to come back to the Vector Institute as an example, I mentioned that incredible recruitment success. I talked to them a bit about what had led to that success in recruiting. So about half of those researchers that I mentioned are not Canadian born, right? That's a pretty large proportion. And I said, well, one of the strengths that we can lean on is that Canada in general, and Toronto as one exemplary example, is very, very multicultural. So one of the really specific examples they shared was they said, well, we don't just recruit the individual, we recruit their family. So for example, if they're from a country that has particular foodstuffs or groceries that are maybe different what you would find in, so there's a chain in Canada called Loblaws, anyway, these are very prevalent. What we'll do is, we'll actually find the particular kind of grocery store that would have just the types of foods that they would have had at home, the same groceries, the same foodstuffs. We'll take their families, not the candidate, over there and explain, here are many of the things that you might have needed to buy to cook the way that you know how to cook and like to eat, and here's where you can get them. Just simple things like that. And to reinforce, that there is a culturally compatible and welcoming home for them, in addition to the fact that they can get the visa. So that component of it, I think, is very emotionally resonant with a lot of people, well beyond whether or not they think it's legally in the country.
Very cool. So, last chance for any questions. People know a lot about Canada. Oh, okay, here's one and then another.
Maybe question, because there's a high diversity of knowledge and skills here, but in terms of legal structure for startups and incentive structures, I grew up in Switzerland where, for example, tax system is not as, how should I say, accommodating to stock options as it is here in the US. How did that change in Canada as well? Is it very similar to here, or is it very different? Or is it disadvantage still as well compared to here?
So,
Thank you, probably.
yeah, the government just announced a new change to stock options literally a month ago in the federal budget, where there's going to be a $200,000 cap on it, unless tax deductible at least. But that is only supposed to apply to older, larger firms. We don't know how that's going to be defined yet. That'll be in the legislation, which we haven't seen, but it's not supposed to apply to startups.
Question back there. Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Alberto Cito from the FBI unit at the Italian consulate. So first and foremost, I'm a former BlackBerry executive, so my heart, my heart is with Canada and the affordable many times. So I have to say that. So a curiosity for Laura, maybe. So C100, I understand, is a community, is a non-profit of Canadian executive in the area. And so I understand most of your work is really about turning into this give back to Canadian entrepreneurs, and that's very important. But I was curious about your experience with FDI and how the government is actually leveraging this community or any other community like this to really disseminate within the kind of big corporates or big investors in the Bay Area to drive foreign direct investment into Canada. And I was just curious about that because that's a great community that every country should have.
It's a great community, it is, and actually, C100 was modeled after similar communities, and perhaps if the Italian community here doesn't have one, we should talk, because
Yeah.
I think it is immeasurable in impact, and I mean that in both senses of the word immeasurable. I'm not sure we can quite measure the degree of impact that a community has had, but it's also quite great. I think it feels great. The first thing I'll answer, I think I should answer your question, but then maybe someone from the consulate who works on FDI should as well. So our organization is a private one, but we do work very closely with our FDI, colleagues in department with Global Affairs Canada and the consulate. The community was started during a dark time in 2010, which was well, you worked for BlackBerry maybe in those days.
It was.
The Canadian technology was in a difficult place. The amount of investment into the Canadian technology sector, I think, rounded to roughly zero. Like I've seen, actually that chart is in here, I think, the PitchBook chart about how much investment was flowing into Canadian technology. So the idea was, if a group of influential, accomplished, lucky Canadians in the Bay Area could get organized, could they have a meaningful impact and become a game-changing asset to Canadian technology entrepreneurs? The answer is yes, they absolutely can, and I think that every expat community should look to other organizations like ours. We certainly borrowed the model actually from the Indian community and the Israeli community, which have seen incredible successes in driving investment back into their home country, but also just the local market knowledge and the ties to the community. In terms of FDI, the Canadian culture is one that is, of course, political. I'd say there are very diverse views on what Canada's approach to FDI should be within the tech community. So I'll tell you, my French counterpart actually at the French Tech mentioned that they actually help flip companies to become American companies. And that's a government-sponsored initiative. This would not fly well in Canadian culture. We really pride ourselves on keeping companies, Canadian and headquartered in Canada, but they need an arm into other countries in the world. The other thing on FDI is that actually the huge number of foreign employers, tech companies that have set up offices in Canada are scary to local tech companies because they pay a lot and they're attractive places to work and they mean a global career and a recognizable brand. These are all very attractive things, especially for new grads. But they do present a challenge and a tougher competition for your burgeoning startup out of the University of Toronto. That said, and so some people are critical of Canada chasing that kind of foreign direct investment. Other folks will actually tell you, in fact, it is our obligation as Canadians working in other countries that we should be putting investments into Canada, whether that is just investing our dollars or our time or setting up kind of branch offices in Canada because we're putting jobs in Canada. And so I'd say that there's a diversity of opinions in the technology sector. I don't think the opinions are that diverse more broadly. I think generally seen as such a positive thing that, we have, I think people just are feeling the crunch of competition, especially in places like Toronto. But someone who actually does foreign direct investment should comment on that, maybe.
Sure.
Yes,
Hi,
thank you, Terry.
Terry, I run the
You
trade
run
section.
it. I was looking for you.
I'm right
See
here.
you.
No, I mean, I think Laura's absolutely right. I think a couple of things. When companies, I have a team that all they do is 100%. They work with Bay Area companies looking to move to Canada or to scale up in Canada. I think for sure talent is always going to be number one, and that including the pipeline of talent. The lower costs for sure are an incentive. I think there's some really compelling tax incentives like the Strategic Research and Development Tax Credit, which really helps companies who want to establish an R&D presence in Canada. But I think also increasingly the immigration climate. That was number 4 consideration. We talked to companies it's like number 2 now. So I think those things work in conjunction together. But I think a big thing is also our partnership. So we don't work in a vacuum here in the consulate. We work with our provincial and our municipal, like our clients are the cities. And so we do that in really close partnerships because there are a lot of incentives that can be stacked on top of one another. So we work in conjunction with those. We have a great relationship with the C100 as well. And so for us, it's really built on partnerships. And that's how we get the results. You know, I'm of the opinion it's all the above. You help Canadian companies scale up in Canada. You also bring great foreign talent into Canada, and you get a really diverse ecosystem. It's not one way of succeeding. I think you've got to do it all together. So that's it.
Thinking about the big barrier to tech companies in Canada, why not to be too afraid of them? We've seen in a lot of countries where they'll go in and naturally will attract a lot of talented younger workers. And very often the more entrepreneurial among those will stay for a while, they get the experience of big companies and then go off and sell companies. So very often the pattern has been those large companies, you know, a Google or Facebook office actually becomes kind of incubators for local talent to get experience and spin off and do their own thing. And in ways they would maybe have a more difficult time doing if they were looking out of a small local company. But I think one of the remarkable things in Canada too is kind of the transition it's managed from sort of a heyday in technology to a technology crash, kind of a resurgent. Like the last time I was there in a business capacity was back when Nortel Networks was really strong and RIM was strong and BlackBerry was the latest technology, and then they weren't. And a lot of those companies went away and the assets were dissipated or distributed, and of course, a lot of the people who were working there, some number actually started off founding companies. They had to be entrepreneurs and they did that. So it's been really interesting to follow this in a historical perspective that Canada really has some major global players in technology, telecom, and then that didn't work anymore, but it's managed to kind of retool, if I understand it correctly, to focus more on kind of company formation, but around science and innovation and startups, and kind of restart that kind of in the same direction with the new foundation.
So BlackBerry is an incredible example, actually. I mean, think of like the best companies you can name. Most companies only get 15 years, really, to lead, and BlackBerry was totally one of those companies. I think like the Facebook, Apple, Netflix, they're in a completely different category on their own, but BlackBerry is a great example, and people did spin off, right, and create all kinds of companies. Some of the best talent in the world came out of BlackBerry. What we haven't seen in Canada quite yet is, you see an ecosystem working when it's like one of those champagne towers, right, where it's like BlackBerry spins off employees who then create something, who then they actually become spinning off and creating something, and they create like an industry in and of itself, all based out of the kind of pyramid-like structure of a major dominant talent attracting company, and it spins off and creates investment into itself. That hasn't quite happened yet, and I think there's a lot of people in Canada, VCs, investors, right, companies themselves, and not to mention all of the rest of us in the ecosystem, in government and nonprofit roles, that are really hoping to see that happen before the next economic crash. Our VC industry in Canada actually doesn't have, I mean, it's trending in the right direction, but it doesn't have super strong IRRs compared to, the Silicon Valley investing ecosystem too. And a major economic event could put a lot of everything that's happening in Canada at risk. And so at least what I hope to see is right now, I mean, Shopify is probably our best example, not to mention all these great, incredible foreign companies moving in. Maybe they'll be able to kind of spin off people who are able to produce the next generation and really feed back into that same system.
Yeah, and if I can add to that too, I mean, so even though I flew here from Toronto, I'm actually based in Ottawa, and you're right, there was this huge tech boom with Nortel and Corel quite a few years ago. And obviously it went bust in certain ways. Mitel still exists and has thrived. But a lot of that talent, is now some of the people that are working at Shopify and some of the people that are creating startups out in Canada, outside of Ottawa. And it's not only a story of Toronto too. There are kind of these ecosystems that are popping up in these similar situations. And it's not only kind of these spin-off startups too, like a BlackBerry or Research in Motion. the amount of money that Mike Lazaridis has put into creating Quantum Valley, and put into the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics, which of course was just part of the photograph of the first black hole. This is some incredible technological advancement that's taking place from those kind of first generation technology companies in Canada.
And the big part of it as well that has been in effect for some time, and actually still something of an effect, is Canadian companies getting bought out at a relatively early to mid stage. I've seen a number of friends sort of sell their companies to the Googles and Apples of the world, and they're relatively small scale acquisitions, often in Canada. And it can be really, really tempting, because if you start a company out of a major university, you've been running for a couple of years, someone comes along and they want to buy it off you for $50 million, and now maybe personally you're going to take home 15 of that, $20 million of that. I mean, a relatively modest or humble Canadian person might be like, that's unbelievable. I will absolutely do that. And more power to them. The challenge, though, is that if you want these companies to reach the point that Laura described, where they are the top of the champagne fountain, that doesn't happen at $50 million. It happens when you go all the way and you go public, and then you stay public and you buy other people out. And so in some ways, it's actually creating a culture around hanging on and just taking it the whole way, which increasingly many Canadian entrepreneurs are doing, but the temptation to get bought out by one of the sort of big international firms is very high.
The only corollary to that as well, I completely agree with that assumption, is and we get into this conversation often regarding early sellouts and whatnot, and certainly in the idea of trying to create companies of scale. And I think these are very important conversations, and certainly we're heading in that direction. But we also forget the other context of this, that we're in a marketplace of an extraordinary amount of global capital right now. The IRRs for even the best Silicon Valley funds are not proven for the most part. So there's a real, there's a change in the financing model of our global economy vis-a-vis, the shift to the fourth industrial revolution companies. And so there are, the best companies in Silicon Valley and also the Amazons of the world are, basically zero cost of capital. And so they have this extraordinary advantage, and this valley has this extraordinary advantage based around this kind of financing arbitrage against the rest of everybody else. And so I think the conversation we're having is mirrored in Tel Aviv, it's mirrored in London, it's mirrored elsewhere. But in the Canadian context, I think that we're, in the relatively short period of time in this last decade, I think that we've gone a long way in terms of the frame of that ambition. I think that's, partly a testament to some folks like yourselves.
I could testify. The Canadians that we are bringing into now down to visit the valley for the first time are swinging for the fences. They are very ambitious and solving really some of the world's biggest problems. So it's quite encouraging to see. Yeah.
And we know that from the number of unicorn founders who are Canadian in the valley. Right here with this. So probably a good point to end it on, because we are out of time, but we've got beer and wine and food in the back. So to wrap it up, I want to thank you, Constance, the team here, and thank Alexandra and Laura and Trevin and the Canada Silicon Valley Games project. This is the beginning of a conversation. We're going to keep rolling on Canada, so stay tuned for more. But in the meantime, thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.